Hey everybody, welcome back to Simming History, where we look at the history of architecture through the lens of The Sims. Before we get started today, if you like the video, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. It helps out the channel. Today we continue a mini-series on World's Fair architecture with the Exposition Universelle of 1889 and its central structure, the Eiffel Tower, which has a surprisingly long, complicated, and sordid history. So let's get into it. Between last episode's Great Exhibition of 1851 in the Crystal Palace and the Exposition Universelle of 1889 in the Eiffel Tower, there were 8 other World's Fairs, including one in Britain, one in the United States, and 3 in France. But as France began preparing for the 1889 fair, their eyes were on Washington, D.C., where the tallest man-made structure had just been completed, the Washington Monument, a giant stone obelisk. And France wanted to beat it. You see, the World's Fairs for about the first 100 years were sort of viewed by the countries of Britain, United States, and France as an opportunity to compete with each other, in particular, even though several other countries also hosted. In addition, France had just started their Third Republic after the Second French Empire had collapsed, and they were eager to kind of prove that they were back. And the French Republic was strong and they could compete on a world stage. Unfortunately, the monarchical countries saw their plans to celebrate the Republic as celebrating the beheading of monarchies, so they really weren't keen to participate. Non-monarchical countries, on the other hand, such as those in Central and South America, immediately agreed to come, and though the US took more time to formally accept the invitation, they eventually did. And so the planning committee began seeking designs for the central structure for the Exposition Universelle in 1884, 5 years before the fair was slated to start. Enter Gustave Eiffel, a self-made man whose engineering firm designed railroads and bridges. His team put together a proposal of a 1,000-foot iron tower, with Eiffel making some personal design improvements right before submission. This design was nearly twice the height of the Washington Monument, which stands at 555 feet. Eiffel won the bid eventually, and 2 years later construction did begin, but those 2 years were not without difficulty. Parisian architects attacked Eiffel's design, believing an architect, not a mere engineer, should design this tower. One such architect was Jules Bordet, and he proposed a 1,000-foot stone tower, which he called the Sun Column, which could not have stood on its own foundations. Quietly, these architects tried to convince the organizer, Edouard Lacroix, to award to Bordet, but in 1886, the day before the designs were officially submitted, they took their attack public, publishing in print that they calling Eiffel's tower inartistic, among other things. The attack towards Eiffel's design increased to include that it couldn't possibly be safe, that it wouldn't stand up to the winds, no builder would be comfortable building it due to its height, and that it would become a giant magnet pulling nails out of surrounding buildings. It's one of my favorites. And then the attacks turned really nasty, calling Eiffel a foreign Jew and the tower as a, quote, Jewish tower. Most people don't realize that leading up to World War II, France was by far more anti-Semitic than Germany. Eiffel felt he had to respond, so he issued a statement saying he was born to Catholic parents in Dijon and was therefore French. But why did they hate his design so much? For a little context, this was an era in France that became later known as La Belle Époque. It was the Golden Age, a time of high design and culture with an emphasis on the arts. It's a period of time in Paris where the Paris Metro was built, as well as the Opera House. It was the time of the Impressionist painters. Very simply, they thought this design was too vulgar and inelegant. Not really a justification for anti-Semitic attack, but really there is no justification for anti-Semitism. The critics' attempts ultimately failed. Eiffel was awarded the commission on June 12, 1886, But the difficulties were still not over. Eiffel had estimated the tower would cost 5 million francs, and the government announced that they would only cover 1.5 million, so Eiffel reached an arrangement. He could keep the tower up for 20 years. The entry fee profits would go to him, and he would use them to pay back personal investors. The fair was being built on the Champ de Mars, the military's training grounds, and the military refused to give up the center of its training grounds for 20 years, and so they petitioned to have the tower built by the river, and the government agreed. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but it changed what kind of foundations that were needed, which ultimately impact the cost and therefore how much Eiffel had to raise. Then, after at least one failed vote in the government finally voted to approve the construction contract. Or rather, that it should be constructed on November 22nd. And then 2 residents who lived on the Champ de Mars, including a countess, filed lawsuits to block construction, claiming it would be an eyesore, that it blocked a desirable walking path, would act as a lightning rod and attract lightning to the neighborhood, and could fall and crush their houses. Fed up with the delay, Eiffel promised to cover the costs of any lawsuits or collapse personally. And on January 7th, 1887, the contract was officially signed and construction could finally begin. Surely it was over, right? No. Even then, 47 of France's greatest designers and painters signed a letter of final protest, calling it a, quote, odious tower. But finally, it was time to build. From January to June in that first year, the foundations were constructed. These foundations included a system of hydraulic lifts that would allow the legs to be adjusted so that the first platform was perfectly level. Then, the 4 wrought iron legs began to rise. There are several builds of the Eiffel Tower of the Sims online, and by all means, go check them out. Most of them show curved legs, like curve up and then into the first platform. But the 4 legs that Eiffel designed to hold up the Eiffel Tower are not curved. They are slanted, but otherwise straight. This actually is because of the load. It allows the load to transfer to the ground more easily. Curved legs have a lot more horizontal or outward thrust, like a dome has, and it just makes the transfer of weight more challenging. Many domes, in fact, have a chain around the base of the dome to counteract those horizontal thrusts. These slanted legs, not curved, also allowed for the installation of elevators in the lower legs. The elevators at this level are double-decker, offset cabs that can travel up to the first and then second platform, where you transfer to a different lift. During construction, Eiffel designed a lift system that could travel within the legs, this is pre-elevators, to lift the sections of the tower up into place, because they did reach a point where the cranes that they had at the time were simply not adequate to build what was going to be the tallest building ever. Like the Crystal Palace, sections were assembled in the shop and then transported to the site, and then lifted up into place. But unlike the Crystal Palace, the Eiffel Tower's parts were irregular. Each section was different, depending on its location in the tower and the angle of the steel at that spot. See, the tower isn't actually curved. After the first platform, the sections slowly change their angle to give the curved appearance as it goes up to the pinnacle. When construction temporarily halted, one Parisian paper declared that the tower was sinking and should be dismantled as soon as possible. Because really, the attacks hadn't ended. In reality, they were working on building the structure needed to build that first platform, and so the vertical movement had ceased. It was really all about the horizontal at that time. In March of 1888, the first platform was completed. The canteen was opened on it for the workers, so they wouldn't have to descend completely for lunch. In that summer in July, Eiffel threw a banquet on the first floor for journalists, 187 feet above the ground, with riveters working above them. Just so you know, all numbers I'm stating here regarding area and height come from the Eiffel Tower's website itself. By July 14th, France's Bastille Day, Eiffel was able to launch fireworks from the completed second platform, which is 377 feet above the ground and therefore the tallest structure in Paris. For comparison, the first platform was 14,485 square feet. The second platform was reduced to 4,692 square feet. And you get that from that changing angle of the steel sections, so that it slowly gets smaller as it goes up. And you would think by this time surely the attacks had ended, yes? No. In the summer of 1888, it was very hot and very stormy, and some people, including a newspaper publisher, claimed the tower had changed the weather of Paris, and that storms gathered around her. But Eiffel's campaign with the journalist was paying off, and he was starting to change some minds, and by the time 1888 ended, the Eiffel Tower had surpassed the Washington Monument in height, winning over quite a few more. As construction continued to the top, Eiffel was struggling to find a firm that could build the elevators. The government was insisting it be a French company, but only Otis had stepped forward. Eventually, with no other option, the government caved, and Otis was awarded the contract to build the elevator from the first to second platform. A French engineer then designed the elevator from the second to the top of the tower. The top observation deck stands at 906 feet with 820 square foot area, and it was originally meant as a gallery, and above that space, Eiffel designed even more rooms, 3 of which were supposed to be dedicated to scientific study, and 1 that he would make into a personal apartment for himself. On March 31st, 1889, the tower had its grand opening. Its construction had taken only 22 months, and its final height, with the top antenna and flagpole, had reached 1,024 feet. On opening day, Eiffel himself gave a tour to 100 people, investors, politicians, and the like. He showed them where the restaurants would be. Currently, there are 2, one on each of the main platforms, but originally there was a third at the very top. Most of the guests stopped at the second platform, which was still higher than any of the other buildings in Paris, but a small party, including all of the journalists, continued the hike up to the very top observation deck, and then an even smaller group ascended the stair to the very top where the flagpole was, at which point Eiffel raised the French flag as fireworks launched from the second platform down below. He really knew how to put on a show. Upon returning to the ground, Eiffel, his 100 guests, and his 199 workers sat down to lunch. Eiffel announced that a plaque listing all of his workers and commemorating their efforts was to be installed. Their work was, of course, not entirely done. Before the fair opened in May, they had to paint the entire tower and, of course, install the much-needed elevators. Opening day of the Exposition Universelle was May 6th and was attended by 200,000 people. The Eiffel Tower was one of the few things actually completed in time. Most of the exhibits were still being assembled, including the American art exhibit. There was still, however, plenty to see, including Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where Annie Oakley, the famed Ohio sharpshooter, stole the show and was immensely popular with the French. There were also many other notable buildings, such as the Central Dome, Gallery of Machines, and Gallery of Liberal Arts. And there were pavilions from all the participating countries, and even a fake Egyptian market. Makes sense if you consider the French had only just recently completed the Suez Canal in Egypt. Thomas Edison had a large exhibit featuring his inventions, and it was also one of the few completed by opening day. There were also a lot of what we would consider moderately controversial exhibits. such as the exploitive exhibiting of indigenous peoples of colonized areas, also known as human zoos. The fair cost just over 41 million francs. It made over 49 million and was attended by just over 32 million people in its 6-month run. In all, 35 countries participated. But what about the Eiffel Tower? How did it fare in the long run? Only 2 buildings survived the Exposition Universelle, one by a Paris architect that was relocated to Martinique, and of course the Eiffel Tower, which obviously lasted longer than the 20 years it was originally supposed to stand. In fact, it lasted longer than the Third Republic that commissioned it, which ended in World War II. Today, it is the most visited structure in the world, with over 7 million yearly visitors, 75% of them foreign. And this is actually one of the places that I would say is not overrated. There are a lot of places in Europe that I would consider overrated when it comes to visiting. If we ever do Versailles, we'll certainly talk about that one. But I have been to the Eiffel Tower and I would absolutely recommend it. If you are even flying in Europe for whatever reason, if you can stop by Paris for a day, go see the Eiffel Tower. It is truly worth it. And my recommendation is go late in the afternoon so that as you're going up the elevator, the sun is setting. Because by the time you get to that top deck, you'll get to see the City of Lights at night. And you should be able to get down to the ground just in time to see the light show. Because today, the Eiffel Tower is lit up every night. And it is truly a sight to see. And whereas it was originally hated by the people of Paris and panned as inelegant, today, of course, it's considered a national symbol of pride. So thanks for joining me today as we took a look at the Eiffel Tower and the Exposition Universelle of 1889. Sorry it was a bit late, but this build did take ages. Ooh, had to cut a lot of stuff out. Next time, we continue our World Fair tour to the White City in Chicago. Until then, you can find me on Instagram at Simming History and on the Sims 4 gallery at Simming History, where there'll be playable versions of many of the builds on this channel, including this one. Thank you to all the new subs. If you haven't yet hit subscribe and we hit 1,000, I will do a live build. And you can watch me suffer in real time. So subscribe and share. I'll see you all next time. Until then, bye!